What's up everybody, Cewpins here and welcome to my MMA Fight Picks channel. We're going to be taking a look at UFC 251 Usman vs Masvidal, which is going to take place on UFC Fight Island. Now we're going to take a look at each card broken down into the early prelims, and the main card. So for this video we're going to take a look at the early prelims, which features 4 fights between Martin Davey Grant. We have Karol Rosa versus Vanessa Melo. We have Raulian Paiva versus Zhalgas Zhumagulov. And Marcin Tybura versus, it's actually Maxim Grishin, so they have the wrong one on here. But that was just announced. Let's take a look at the first fight here. We have Martin the Spartan Day versus Dangerous Davey Grant in a bantamweight battle. These guys have about a similar record and about similar height and reach. Martin Day is 3 years younger. Not too much of a difference on the stats, but Martin Day is a slight favorite. And let's see if we can take a look at the records here. Martin Day, who's 9-3, I believe he has 1 fight in the UFC, and it's a split decision loss to Pingyang Liu. So hasn't won in the UFC and hasn't faced any guys that are UFC caliber and won. He has a fight on the Contender Series, but he lost the decision there. And it took him 3 more wins to get back in the UFC. He has some finishes on his record, which are good. Looks like he KO'd a guy who was 8-0. He has that's not a very great record. Has a submission win, couple submission wins on his record. But nothing too crazy here. He's been fighting amateur since 2014. And Dangerous Davey Grant has a little bit more experience, I believe. I think he's been fighting longer and has some experience on the Ultimate Fighter. Yeah, he had a stint on the Ultimate Fighter in 2013, 2 finishes on the Ultimate Fighter, but then ultimately got finished by Chris Holdsworth on the finale here. And it looks like he has 3 losses by finish in the UFC, all by submission. Got rear naked choked here, armbarred here, triangle choked by Manny Bermudez. He has 1 decision win, 2 decision wins, a split decision win over Popov, and then a decision win in 2016 over Marlon Chito Vera, which Chito Vera is a really good fighter, but has made a lot of improvements since 2016. So maybe this doesn't have a lot of value here, but it does make Davey Grant look good as the underdog here. And he has experience in fighting all the way back to 2008. So it just has more time in the cage, more years in the cage. But this fight is interesting. I don't have a pick either way, but I'm leaning on no decision because it is the first fight of the night, and there are a lot of finishes back and forth between these guys. I'm probably not betting on this fight, though. Let's take a look at the next fight here. Here we have a women's bantamweight fight between Vanessa Melo and Karol Rosa. And just looking at the stats here, the first thing that jumps off the page to me is the 7-year age gap. Looks like Rosa is going to be 7 years younger going into this fight, which should give her a little bit of an advantage. But this being a women's MMA fight and both fighters being under 35, it's not going to be a tremendous deal, but it's worth noting. And it's also worth noting that Rosa is going to have a 1-inch height and a 2.5-inch reach advantage. So let's take a closer look at the records here. I believe both fighters are fighting out of Brazil. Melo has a 10-7 record, which isn't great, but I believe she has a lot of experience in different organizations here. Only 2 fights in the UFC, which are both decision losses, 1 to Tracy Cortez and then 1 to Irene Aldana, who's actually really good. She's going to be fighting Holly Holm soon. The rest of the record shows most of her fights go to decision. She does have a couple of finishes here. Looks like both of them are rear naked choke. First round. But mostly everything else is decision, and she's been fighting since 2011. Let's take a look at Rosa here, who does have the age advantage, height advantage, slight reach advantage, but nothing is tremendous. She has 1 fight in the UFC, which is a split decision win, which is kind of good, but winning your UFC debut with a split decision is not how you want to win your UFC debut. We have a couple of finishes here. I see some submissions, some finishes to striking, doctor stoppage. It's probably to striking. Looks like she also has a little bit of a submission weakness here. 2 losses to submission, and then the other loss is to a decision. So she can be finished. She does have finishing ability, but here most of her fights go to decision. So this fight actually is looking good for the over, but I know a lot of people are picking Rosa here. She is the favorite. I'm not going to bet either way on this fight, I don't think. I don't have anything locked in. I do like a Rosa pick, but I don't know if I'm going to take a stab at these odds. But let's take a look at the next fight here. Next up, we have a flyweight fight here between Zhalgas Zhumagulov and Raulian Paiva. This fight is interesting because it is another one featuring a 7-year age gap. Raulian Paiva will be 7 years younger than his opponent and also 3 inches taller. I couldn't find the reach for Zhumagulov, but I'm going to assume the difference is probably about the same, but we don't know for sure. Zhalgas Zhumagulov is making his UFC debut, so that is interesting to note here. He is 13-3 on his record and is fighting out of Kazakhstan. Who wants to smoke some Erkin Kush? What a gym name. He does have a couple wins over UFC fighters, or ex-UFC fighters, excuse me. Ali Bagatinov, ex-UFC, Tyson Nam, ex-UFC. Lots of wins on Fight Nights Global, which is a pretty decent organization. They do have some decent competition on there. So this is a pretty decent record because most of the fights are on FNG. He only has 3 losses, and 1 is a decision, unanimous, 1 is a split decision, and then 1 is lost to punches. So that's worth noting here. He doesn't get finished a lot, has only been finished once. Let's take a look at Paiva here, who has a pretty impressive record. 19-3, he has 6 more wins than his opponent, and he's 7 years younger. So having 22 fights by the time you're 24 is pretty impressive. So he has a few fights in the UFC, but has had a little bit of trouble. He's been finished once due to a doctor stoppage. It's not really a finish, but, you know, the doctor said that you couldn't continue. So he didn't make it to decision here. His other fight that made it to decision was a split decision. He didn't end up winning over Kai Kara-France, but he does have a finish over Mark De La Rosa, which is worth noting, and that is a second-round knockout. The rest of his record is pretty good here. 1 fight on the Contender Series, got into the UFC with a split decision win. And then lots of fights between different organizations here, but a pretty impressive record overall. 19 wins. He's lost by Anaconda choke in 2015, and the only other stoppage was a doctor stoppage. So he has a similar record as far as getting finished and has a lot of wins on his record. I don't really have a pick on this fight, but I am kind of leaning on Zhumagulov. I don't know. At 150, I'm not going to take a stab, but if I see some crazy dog odds here, I might look at it. But I have no bet here. I am leaning a little bit on Zhumagulov and maybe on the over, but there is no bet here. Let's take a look at the next fight. Here we have the only heavyweight fight on the card with a bout between Marcin Tybura and Maxim Grishin, who's actually a late replacement for Alexander Romanov. Now, I had a bet on the previous fight to not go to decision, mainly because of Romanov's record, but I'm carrying that no decision bet over to this fight, even though it's more likely to go decision. I'm less confident about it, but I still think it's a pretty good pick. I'm avoiding the straight line or the main line bets on here, and we're just going to take a stab at the prop. So the thing that's most worthy of note here is this will be Grishin's UFC debut on kind of a short notice here. And also, most of his fights are at light heavyweight, and he will be fighting at heavyweight here, so I believe he's going to have a weight disadvantage. The height and the reach aren't too far off. The height's the same. The reach is 2 inches shorter, but the weight difference should be noticeable. I see him stepping on the scale around 225, 230. He doesn't seem like he's a huge light heavyweight, but he does have fights years ago at heavyweight. Let's take a look at their records here. Tybura has an 18-6 record with a lot of fights in the UFC. He has a pretty impressive record. He has some pretty impressive wins, but he also has some big losses here. Lost to Werdum, Derek Lewis, lost to Augusta Sakai. He got finished by Shamil Abdurakhimov, Augusta Sakai, and Derek Lewis all in the last couple of years. So I kind of like this one for no decision because I think either guy could get finished, and I'm just not sure who. Otherwise, I'd be picking, a certain fighter to win inside the distance here. There are a lot of decisions on both guys' records, but I think that the fact that it's a late replacement fight is going to help us, and the fact that there is a weight difference is going to help us with the no decision pick. So we do have a lot of impressive wins here, lots of impressive finishes for Tybura. He's shown his ability to finish and get finished. But let's take a look at his opponent who's making a debut. Grishin has a 30-7 record. And this will be his first fight in the UFC, but he has fought a lot of high-level guys before, especially with all of his fights in PFL. There's just some really good competition on here. So he has shown his ability to win in higher-level fights. But he does get finished. He has got finished before. It shows on his record. He does get a lot of finishes, but he can get finished. That's why we're looking at a finish on both sides here, because most of his losses are to finish, and there are a couple of decision wins. But I'm not leaning either way on a fighter here. We do have about even odds, but I do have a bet. I have two different bets on no decision. I got one at -190, and then I added more to it at -210. I might add more if it doesn't get any worse, but this is one of my biggest bets on the card. So those are my initial looks for the early prelims of UFC 251. I am going to do a video for the regular prelims and the main card, so be sure to subscribe to the channel for those. And I may do an update on a lot of these leans after the weigh-ins. So sometimes things change after you see the guys weigh in and square off. So we may do an update then, but make sure to subscribe for the other videos so you can see our prelim and main card predictions. Thank you for watching.